Imagine a studio that made an RPG, a burglary simulator, a shoot 'em up, a fighting game, an adventure game and a real-time strategy game all within 6 years. They sold millions of copies, were eventually acquired by Rockstar Games, and chances are you never heard of them. This is the story of Neo Software.
Exciting sessions on today's hottest selling home computer. Vital, up-to-date information to inform the novice and intrigue the experienced.
Like so many European game studios, the story of Neo Software begins with the Commodore 64. Hannes Seifert, who would later found Neo together with Niki Laber and Peter Baustädter, released his first game on the C64 in 1987. His first credited game, The Lost Planet, followed in 1989. It was a classic illustrated text adventure that, as far as I can tell, was never translated into English. In addition to programming, Seifert also contributed music to later Amiga productions such as 8069 and Burn Time, slowly moving from hobbyist development toward a professional career in games. Niki Laber began on the Commodore Amiga, working for Silverbyte. His early credits include Quattro, a simple puzzle game, Red Race and fantasy games, a sports game set in a fantasy world with role-playing elements. Seifert composed music for some of these early titles, which is where the two presumably first crossed paths. In 1991, Seifert programmed Project Icarus for Databecker, where he met Peter Baustädter, the art director and later third founder of Neo Software. Project Icarus is especially interesting because it already contained many of the ideas that would later appear in Neo's debut title, Voyage. In a sense, it was the prototype for the company that was about to be born. With the combined programming, music and art skills of the trio, Neo was ready to become something much bigger.
In New York today, Commodore International unveiled a new personal computer it hopes will give a boost to that troubled business. Pop artist Andy Warhol was on hand to show off the machine's graphics generating capabilities, which the company calls a major sales feature, and the computer even talks.
Now is the time for all good men to buy Amigas.
Neo began work in 1992 and was officially founded in 1993 in Vienna, Austria. Its first release was Voyage for the Amiga and MS-DOS. I will go into that game in further detail later in the video, but it was at least moderately successful and helped the company to get a foot on the ground. The game was distributed by Flare Software in Europe and got later a US release in 1995 by Pro One Software under the name Distant Frontiers, which didn't make a big splash. On the heels of that successful debut, they released The Clue a year later. This very unique robbery simulator turned out to become their first big hit with over 1 million copies sold. Moby Games does list a US release by the publisher Compile UK, but I could not find any further evidence of that. Suffice to say, the game was mostly popular in Europe, but to put the game's release into context, the widely influential and well-known adventure game Myst also sold just 1 million copies in its first year. They followed up with a sequel to Voyage in 1995, which received decent reviews but failed to live up to the success of a first game. I could not determine the concrete reason why the second game was not as popular, but it probably had something to do with the decline of the Amiga platform. The DOS audience at that time had a wide variety of RPG titles to choose from, and Voyage had not been as successful on that platform than on the Amiga. The game was never officially translated into English, but there is a fan translation of the game from 2018. But that was not the only release they had that year. There were 3 more games they either co-developed or published in 1995. Prototype, a very nice looking shoot 'em up for MS-DOS, Dark Universe, a turn-based sci-fi strategy game, and Cedric and the Lost Sceptre, a platformer with point-and-click adventure-like inventory puzzles. Unfortunately, none of these games were able to repeat the success of Neo's first 2 titles, though Prototype got a bit more recognition in later years from the DOS gaming community. 1996 saw more releases for the dwindling Amiga in the form of Spherical Worlds, Fighting Spirit and Black Viper, plus the point-and-click adventure Mutation of J.B for MS-DOS, which looked dated compared to the plethora of other available adventure games at the time. With the continued lack of success, Neo Software was forced to shut down its publishing arm to avoid bankruptcy and focused all its energy on its next flagship title, Rent a Hero, which was still 2 years away. For many other game companies, this would have been the slow death of the studio, but focusing on in-house production luckily turned out to be the right call, as Rent a Hero was released in 1998 to good reviews and sales numbers. Which is astonishing in its own right, as the point-and-click adventure genre was definitely behind their heydays and had a hard time to capture the audience attention as it used to do. This probably also has something to do with the company's ties to Germany, as adventure games were always a big deal here, even in later years after they faded into obscurity in other regions, especially the US. Hot on the heels of this comeback came another big hit that cemented Neo's future, Alienations. RTS games were extremely popular after the release of StarCraft in 1998, but Germans were generally more interested in medieval than sci-fi games. The Settler series is one of the most beloved in our country and also moved more toward real-time strategy at that time. So to say that Alienations took some inspiration from those titles is probably understating it. Nevertheless, the game was well made and added a unique touch with 3 asymmetric races you could play as, so almost a bit like a Settler-StarCraft hybrid, you could say. With over 150,000 units sold just here in Germany and close to 1 million worldwide, Neo was back in the spotlight, and it did not take long before someone noticed.
Hello, I'm Victoria Bracagno for TechTVNews.com. It's tough enough losing your job, but for thousands of laid-off.com workers, something more is at stake.
The advent of the .com industry was a tumultuous time. In 1999, Computech Media bought a majority stake in Neo with plans to shift the studio's focus toward online games. Computech is best known in Germany as the publisher of gaming magazines like the long-running PC Games or the MMO-focused website Buffed. But before that deal really settled, Computech sold Neo again in early 2000 to Gameplay.com along with 3 other subsidiaries. Under Gameplay.com, Neo even started work on Online Pirates, a multiplayer spin-off of Sid Meier's Pirates that fit the growing online gaming trend. The game was in development for about 2 years but had ultimately been canned. The final twist came through Toga Holdings, the parent company of Pixel Broadband Studios. In late 2000, Gameplay.com acquired Toga Holdings, and that transaction included a joint exploitation agreement with Take-Two. That agreement effectively opened the door for Take-Two to buy Neo Software. So when Take-Two finally acquired the studio in January 2001, it was the end result of a chain of business deals rather than a simple direct purchase. They did release 2 games still under their original name, The Sting, a sequel to The Clue, and a port of Max Payne, before being renamed Rockstar Vienna in 2003 on the company's 10th anniversary. Hannes Seifert remembers this as a bittersweet moment. Losing the original name felt like losing what he had built with his co-founders, but in retrospect it was still the right thing to do. Under its new name, the company continued work on ports of Max Payne 2, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City. In 2004, they started work on Manhunt 2, not a port but the first actual in-house development for Take-Two. Unfortunately, Rockstar Vienna was closed down in 2006 and Manhunt 2 was handed over to Rockstar London. The closure was declared a cost-cutting measure and came so abruptly that the fired employees did not get any prior notice and were turned back at the company's office doors. Adding insult to injury, Manhunt 2 did not include credits for many of the people who worked at Rockstar Vienna, even though much of what they had developed allegedly was still part of the final game. Seifert and Laber founded a new company, Games That Matter, after the closure of Rockstar Vienna and released the game Cursed Mountain to middling reviews. The company was disbanded by its owner Koch Media soon after. But to end this history on a positive note, all 3 founders of Neo found success after leaving the company behind. Hannes Seifert continued his work in management positions in the games industry and contributed to the 2016 reboot of the Hitman series before working for Riot and becoming the co-CEO of Crytek this year. Niki Laber left the game industry behind to focus on AI and simulation software, but not completely, as he also serves as the president of the Austrian Association for Entertainment Software. Peter Baustädter's career led him to Hollywood, where he works on big-budget film and TV productions such as Avatar or The Rings of Power in the role of a VFX and virtual art director. In the end, Neo's software legacy was bigger than any single game or any of the three founders. It helped show that a serious, internationally successful studio could exist in Austria at all, and that is a meaningful part of the country's gaming history. The scene around it has grown enormously since then. By 2024, Austria had around 150 active game development companies with roughly 1080 developers and about 93 million euros in revenue, which makes Neo feel less like an isolated oddity and more like one of the early roots of a much larger industry.
Oh, about time you show up. Matt, take the lead!
Now, before we jump into Neo's games, let me tell you about my new game that just released last week. Max Savage is a throwback to retro space action games with the added twist that you can actually land on planets and explore them. It features a cinematic story campaign with full voice acting and tons of upgrades for your various ships. If that sounds enticing, you can find the link to the Steam page in the video description below. And now, on with the video.
No, this is too dangerous. You stay here.
What? No, come on!
Now, even though I'm holding the big box of Neo's first released game in my hands, I have to admit that I never really got into it. I just always liked the spaceship's design. Voyage is an interesting genre mix of dungeon crawler, trading sandbox and tactical space combat. It might not excel at any of these parts, but the combination of the systems is pretty unique and overall well executed. I also found it intriguing that you're flying a spaceship that's a living organism, though besides some cool flavor text, this doesn't tie much into the gameplay. The character creation is also kind of unique, where you choose the parents of your character and the game will automatically create the offspring from a DNA combination. Overall, the game was well received with a Moby score of 7 and people still seem to fondly remember playing it on their Amigas. Now, The Clue on the other hand is a game I spent a lot of time with. At its core, it's a robber simulator, but it also has a strong adventure feel with wandering around town, talking to people, buying and selling items and a well-told background story. Once you have assembled your crew, scouted the location and prepared your equipment, it's time to plan the heist. This is where the game really shines. You switch between all the characters involved in the robbery and move them with the cursor keys while the game records your movements. That way you can have multiple characters doing different things at the same time. You have to be careful to avoid guards and alarm systems and not to make too much noise or leave behind too much evidence. Then when the time comes, you execute the plan and watch with bated breath, crossing your fingers that nothing goes wrong. The cleaner the job, the less likely you are to be caught, but the police also collects long-term evidence, so even if you get lucky on a single run, things can still get messy afterward if too much evidence was built up. Overall, it is a great game and worthy of both the success it enjoyed and its 7.6 rating on Moby Games. Honestly, from the time I spent playing Voyage 2, it just seemed like more of the same, with this time around with 3D graphics for the dungeon crawler part, which made everything look a bit uglier and harder to navigate. The ship parts presentation got a bit of a bump in production quality, but for a game from 1995 it's not very impressive. It doesn't help that the interface is also pretty clunky and confusing, and I had to refer to the manual to get anywhere in the game. So fans of the first game will probably still very much enjoy its sequel, but as the Amiga was losing momentum and the PC audience had many other RPGs to choose from, the game didn't appeal to many. It did score higher than the first game on Moby Games with a 7.4, but that's only based on 7 reviews from Germany compared to the 20 international ones that are listed for the first game. Now, one of the other games released that year was Prototype, a shoot-'em-up exclusive to MS-DOS. Neo co-developed this one with Surprise Productions into a pretty fun and competent arcade game. The star of the show are the detailed pre-rendered graphics, but the gameplay also has a lot to offer with an interesting weapons upgrade system where you can actually choose which weapon to upgrade next. Now, this game is pretty difficult as most shmups are, but it has a very generous free save system, so you can basically save scum your way through it. I really had fun playing this one, even though I was struggling with the difficulty, and the balance seemed a bit all over the place, where the first level was much harder than the third, for example. Still, there weren't many good shmups on MS-DOS, so I can easily recommend this, with Moby Games agreeing at a 7.3 rating. The third release for 1995 was Dark Universe Hüter des Friedens, a strategy game exclusively released in Germany for MS-DOS from a third-party developer. It plays a bit like a watered-down version of Master of Orion, lacking the polish and depth of the classic. It's not terrible, but just doesn't bring anything new to the table and plays pretty repetitively. It doesn't look spectacular either, so there's really not much reason to get back to the game nowadays. Cedric and the Lost Sceptre, another 1995 release, this time for the Amiga, is a much more interesting game to me. It's a platformer and point-and-click adventure hybrid. Well, without pointing and clicking, but all the inventory puzzles you would expect. Now, if you compare Cedric to the console games from that same time, like Yoshi's Island, Rayman or Donkey Kong Country 2, you can quickly see how dated it looks and plays. Amiga platformer games always had the reputation of being a bit clunky, and this is no exception. Now, if the game had released 5 years earlier, I'm sure it would have been pretty successful, but as it stands I cannot easily recommend it unless you really want to experience the genre mix yourself. That being said, if you want to play a game that's half adventure, half platformer, I would strongly recommend playing the Holy Gosh Darn instead, which is great. Now we move on to 1996, but Neo was still publishing games for the Amiga, in this case Spherical Worlds. It's a fairly basic action puzzle game where you roll around, shoot things and try to find your way to the end of the level. There is not really much else to say about it beyond the slippery physics, which are the main challenge. I'm not sure that makes for especially fun gameplay, and the game was mostly ignored by the general audience anyway. Back on the PC, we are still a bit late to the party with the point-and-click adventure Mutation of J.B. You play as a kid who gets transformed into a pig and has to solve puzzles to get out of that predicament. By this time though, we already had LucasArts adventures like 7 Max and even Full Throttle and The Dig, so a fairly basic hand-drawn comedy adventure was not exactly going to turn any heads. Unfortunately, this does not just look basic for its time, but also features some pretty poor writing and uninspired puzzles. Amiga 5.6 on Moby Games pretty much explains why this game did not exactly fly off the store shelves. Believe it or not, we are back on the Amiga, this time with the fighting game Fighting Spirit. And you know what? I thoroughly enjoyed playing this one. I'm not much of a fighting game expert, but this was easy to get into and felt good to control. I was even able to reliably pull off some special moves and button mash the opponent to death. The balance between the different characters feels a bit off, with some of them being quite overpowered, but for an hour or two this is actually a lot of fun. I'm also a big fan of the presentation and even the character roster design, especially that humanoid tiger thing, which is cool. No wonder this one sits at a whopping 8.0 on Moby Games and might be a real hidden gem. If this game had come out just a few years earlier and maybe also on another system, I could see it being one of the better Street Fighter clones of its time. The last game of the year, again on the Amiga, was Black Viper, a very basic bike racing and shooting game. The only thing that really stands out here is that it has an upgrade system, but otherwise it's extremely boring and repetitive. I kind of like the game's vibe with its dystopian future theme, but it's just awkward to play and too clunky to recommend to anyone.
Well, what do you know? Another total failure. This way I'll never be famous enough to make real money.
Now we're skipping 2 years ahead to 1998, where Neo was desperately looking for a new success and found it in Rent a Hero, a competently made point-and-click adventure which looked pretty nice for its time with its pre-rendered graphics and animations. The game has nothing to do with the Sega game series of the same name that's probably much better known in the US. You play as a hero for rent in a world that's about 2/3 fantasy and 1/3 science fiction. I haven't played far, so besides working controls I can't say much about the game's quality, but with a solid 7.0 on Moby Games it seems to be alright. It was certainly good enough to land with a German audience and brought Neo back on its track. Just a year later came the release of Alienations. This real-time strategy game definitely places more emphasis on city building than combat. That is no surprise, since it wears its inspiration on its sleeve, the Settlers series. You build structures, train units and try to keep your little people happy. I'm not a big fan of the game's visual design, but at the time people seemed to be really drawn to it. Even without a tutorial, it was pretty easy to play and felt more like a casual experience, though later missions probably pose a bit more of a challenge. I think this game introduced many new computer players to the genre, since it was not as intimidating as some of its contemporaries. The game even got a sequel a year later and, of all things, a Game Boy Color Zelda-like in 2002, though those were developed by Voyage Vienna rather than Neo Software. Now I'm not going to talk about Max Payne here, since Neo only ported it to the Xbox. That brings us to a final game from 2001 under the Neo name, The Sting. And yes, it really does sting. And stink. And sorry, as a sequel to my favorite Neo game The Clue, this one is just aggravating. The game is so unbelievably ugly that I don't even want to look at it while editing this video. 2001 gave us Black and White, Comanche 4 and, as mentioned earlier, Max Payne. And this is what we got? GTA 3 released just a few months later, so this drab city design with its blocky visuals and bleak textures looks more like a shareware game from the 90s. It lost all the charm of the original and replaced it with cartoon freaks and an infuriating control scheme. Yes, you can still plan and execute robberies like in the original, but the clunky pathfinding and finicky controls take all the fun out of it. The game still reviewed pretty well with a 6.8 on Moby Games, so maybe it gets better if you play it for longer, but I could not force myself to do that for the life of me. So there you have it, the complete history of Neo Software from Vienna, Austria. I hope you enjoyed the look at one of the longer lasting 90s studios from Europe, and if you did so, why not subscribe to the channel for more retro and adventure game content in the future. And with that, see ya!